But if there's an indemnity provision, actually Frank is on the line. And in a lot of contexts, that will make sense. I mean, probably not that one, but other ones that we can think about, where people really are much more like a contractor. Another idea, is you can keep things limited when it comes to severance. You can look at, just keeping the minimums under the Employment Standards Act for severance, which often will be much, much lower than what they might get under a reasonable notice analysis, and may even not be much more than you were planning to put in anyway with something like a 30-day provision. There's a lot of ways that we can do this. We can find a way to maybe build in something like a 4% vacation into what they're getting paid anyway. So there are a lot of ways that we can fix things if we're looking at it in advance and saying, what can we do to make this person, A, look a lot more like a contractor, and B, take the form, even if they are an employee, so that we don't get burned, so that they don't suddenly get vacation pay on top of that hourly rate. We build that into the hourly rate, so it's still whatever we negotiated, but we've come up with a slightly different format. So there's a lot of things that we can do if we're sitting down to either avoid the the employee categorization just by tweaking a few things that don't really change the business reality, or that at least take the sting out of it if the person is found to be an employee, because we've just sort of calculated everything and then added on an employee bump up, but reached the same number in the end. People may have a lot of questions about the contractor issue. I'm happy to take some questions, I think, toward the end, so don't forget about them. I'm going to jump to another area now. One of the other issues that is new in the legislation, and this is one that's not yet enforced, but coming up very fast, it's coming up April 1st, is the equal pay provision. So for many years, it's been the case that equal pay is required, if people are doing exactly the same job and you draw a distinction on gender, that's not okay. But now, if people are doing substantially the same work in the same location, and it requires substantially the same skill and experience, the legislation says they now have to be paid the same amount. If one of them negotiated something better than the other one, apparently that's no longer a valid excuse. So this is something which has been sold as dealing with contract staff, seasonal staff, part-time staff who are getting paid less than doing the same job as permanent, full-time, regular staff. That's not what the legislation itself says. The legislation itself has the definition that I gave you. If it's substantially the same work in the same location, requiring the same skill and experience, then there's you need to be paying the same rate. You can get around that right under the legislation with things like seniority or merit or something that's based on the quality of what the person's or quantity that they're producing, like if they get a certain amount for whatever they achieve. But if it's just in the absence of those issues, there's a problem. So to some degree, I think a lot of this has been missed. The significance of this has been missed, and we're going to need to see how this develops. It's not even in force until April. But does this mean that you need to look at like a lockstep approach to wages? Instead of negotiating differently with each person, that's something that needs to be looked at, and it is a risk that's out there. One of the other important pieces to this is if somebody complains about this and you're not allowed to lower one person's wage, you have to raise the lower wage. Nobody's allowed to make less money as a result of this. They can only make more money. I guess the business can make less money, but that doesn't count. So that's an issue. And there is even a system that's set up within the legislation, which is to say an employee who thinks they're not getting paid the same as they should be because they think there's other people doing the same job, they make a request to the employer, and then you have to respond in writing to that request, explaining what the difference is. So be very careful about thoughtlessly sending off an email when somebody asks, because you're engaging a part of the legislation and you're probably going to be tied to that email. So be careful about that. And again, solutions. How do we deal with this? So one thing, solutions are going to come, no, it's okay, it's okay. I'm going to come to solutions after I talk about this next part, because I didn't memorize the order of the slides. There's another part to the equal pay, another one that's coming in April 1st. And this is in relation to temporary help agencies. So the situation I talked about before is people are employees of the same organization. The legislation also has exactly the same provisions where a temporary outside agency is providing somebody. So again, if they're doing a job that is substantially the same in the same location, requiring the same skill and experience, then they need to be getting paid the same amount of money. And again, nobody can make less. Again, you have to respond in writing, and there's no reprisal. One of the interesting twists, so that's in itself, it's interesting. The other twist here is that if the employee is right in this complaint, the agency is the one that has to pay. So the agency is defined as the one who has to pay the difference in that. Okay, now let's look at solutions. So the first thing is to understand, for example, if you're an agency, well, what are the regular folks getting paid? Otherwise, you have no idea what the situation is. But also think about who the comparators would be. Think about this one in advance and figure out, how am I going to say why this person is getting paid less? And ideally, write that down somewhere. So I myself am thinking about this. I don't pay all of the associate lawyers who work for me the same amounts of money. I've worked out different deals with everybody. That's not going to cut it with the Ministry of Labor. Luckily, I'm going to think of a whole bunch of ways in which those lawyers are different, because they brought different experience sets to the table. They brought different books of business to the table. They're focused on different areas. So that I'm going to find a way to say they're not, the same. I'm going to have my other factors in mind to begin with, so that I can say, if somebody asks, of course I work with a bunch of employment lawyers, they're going to know this, but I'm one step ahead, and so I already know what I'm going to say when they ask, and I'm on the lookout in the future for ways to codify why I'm paying one person one amount, the other person another amount. At some level, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be something I can point to and say, here is why, Joe is getting paid this amount, but Sally is getting paid this amount. It has nothing. It's not because they're not the same. Here are the factors that I can point to. Other solutions right there in the legislation are, think about merit and seniority. Use those if they're going to be helpful. And then if you're in an agency situation and you are the agency or you are the employer, watch out for this. So if you're the agency, think about punting responsibility with an indemnity provision back onto the employer. So if I'm an agency and I'm running the risk that I'm paying people a different amount than the regular employed folks of my placement, maybe I'm going to put in my contract that client is on the hook if I get an order from the Ministry of Labor to make up for that difference. And if you happen to be using agency, temporary help agencies, watch out for them doing that to you. It's probably going to be somewhere in the chicken scratch of the contract that you're not going to read. I've used temporary help agencies, and there's a couple of pages of terms that nobody reads. Keep an eye out for that one. And if you aren't going to do that, think about that. And just be aware of this as a risk. Okay. Next issue, personal emergency leave. So this is another provision that's already in place. I'll pause here to make things awkward for the guy who came in late. No, I'm just kidding. So this one's already in place. And what this provision is a relatively innocuous provision. It's just a small change to what's already there. So what's already there is if there's an illness or an injury to the employee or a family member, and there's a defined list, that employee is entitled to leave. Okay. Now, what's new is they're going to get 10 days of leave within any calendar year, but the first 2 have to be paid. This applies to everybody. There's no exemption if you only have like 1 employee or 5 employees. It applies to everybody, every employer. It also applies to employees who have just started. Once you've been there for a week, you've got all the protections. And there's another change. You used to actually, as an employee, you used to be required to provide a note from a qualified medical practitioner. Now, as the employer, you're not allowed to ask for that note. Notes are bad. Notes from a qualified medical practitioner, at least, are bad. So some of the, 2 days paid isn't a huge number. That's not, in my view, the big worry. The big worry here is that people are going to be ignorant of this provision, and they're going to say no to somebody who's not a regular, employee, and they're going to say, I'm not paying you for that. And then that's going to taint everything that comes afterward. So if you fire that employee or terminate that contractor, it's going to look like you did it because they asked you to comply with the Employment Standards Act. They're going to have a strong case for reprisal, which, if you don't know, means you get to pay their wages up until they find a new job. If that's 6 months from now, that's 6 months from now. So it's not a fun situation to be in, particularly maybe dealing with somebody who was very short service and made this request, after they've just been there a week. And now you're going to say, come on, I'm not paying. You've only been here a week. I'm not going to pay you, to be sick your second week. Or you're a contractor, not an employee. I'm not going to pay you when you're not working. Be careful. So what can we do about this? Let's jump to our next slide, which I hope is the solution slide. There we go. Okay. 1, just be aware of it. So knowing that this is out there means that, if somebody requests the 2 days and they've been there for a week and there's at least an argument that they're an employee, pay the 2 days because it's probably a much smaller price than anything else you're going to have to pay. That's the biggest takeaway. Second, think about making a virtue of this. Why not, you can always trumpet it in an employment contract. 2 days of paid sick leave every year. I'm giving it to you now. But yet you've still got, for all that there's this idea of no more notes, if you are suspicious, if you're suspicious of so that somebody's sick, and we're talking here probably a traditional employment situation, you can still request evidence. You just can't request a note from a qualified medical practitioner. So nothing stops you from saying, can I get a note from the receptionist from your doctor that you in fact went to an appointment this day? Or, can I get a copy of those test results from the hospital? Because, that's not a note from a qualified medical practitioner, So there's ways around it if you really do have that concern. So think about that. And again, if it's the context of a longer term relationship and you're worried about, maybe the person's not fit to return to work, you are still allowed to ask for a note confirming they're fit to return to work. So in some ways, you could just ask for that note, even if they wanted to just be away for 2 days, and then they have to go to their doctor and get this note anyway. So it creates an interesting way around the problem. But the biggest one is just beware of this one, because I'm positive that this is going to blow up 1,000 times in the course of 2018. Okay. The next issue, which is the last one that I'm going to talk about, is scheduling. There are a whole bunch of provisions that are coming in. They're not in force right now. They're not in force until January 1st, 2019, so approximately just under a year from now. But they are going to make life a lot more difficult if you're trying to be flexible. So one of them is that an employee can request changes. So if the employee doesn't want to work on their present schedule or in their present location, they're allowed to request that you make that change, and you need to respond and explain why you can't make that change. And you can't take revenge against them for asking. There's also the return of what's called the 3-hour rule. So if the employee regularly works for more than 3 hours and they come into work, but for whatever reason you say, actually there's not as much work here, you have to pay them for a minimum of 3 hours. Also, on-call pay. If somebody's on call and they don't get called in, they need to be paid at least 3 hours of their regular wages for every 24-hour period that they're on call. So that isn't to say that if they're on call for 12 hours one day and for 12 hours another day, that you get to call that 24 hours. But in any given day in which they're on call, they need to get at least 3 hours of pay. So think about that one as you're setting up your schedule. And then the one that's giving, I think, probably the greatest headaches is there's now a 4-day rule. So the aim of this is to get employers to schedule people at least 4 days in advance, 96 hours in advance. If you don't do that, you're still allowed to have the employees, still allowed to ask the employees to come in, but they can say no, and you can't punish them for saying no. If you did post a schedule or did schedule them to work, and then you change it less than 4 days in advance, you need to compensate them. So those are so that's that one again. Not in force right now. Still got a whole year, we don't have a whole year. We have almost a whole year, but that one's out there. Now, again, the biggest problem with this is, it's going to be awkward for some people. It's going to be businesses. It's going to be no problem. For others, it's going to be a huge headache. But again, the biggest problem is probably reprisal. The biggest problem is if somebody complains about this or asks for this, and then you do something to them afterwards, having that appear as though it were retaliation for them asking. That's really the biggest pitfall, because you can always just keep posting the schedule the day before. Nothing's going to prevent you from doing that. And if the person is declining to work consistently, you're probably going to find some reason to get rid of them. And if you're telling them, no, I really need you, they're usually going to agree and come in, whatever their plans were. But just be careful about taking a reprisal. And that's ultimately, I think, where this really becomes the biggest issue, is when an employee makes a complaint about this. Be careful that if you're going to subsequently do something to that employee, have a nice, clear, other reason why you're doing that, that's got some documentation behind it, even if whether it's an internal email exchange or whatever it is. Okay, we can go ahead to the questions slide, because I was told don't take too long. We want people to be able to do stuff. So does anybody have any questions about any of this or any other employment law issue under the sun in Canada? see there's a ton of questions out there.
I didn't understand what is 2-day illness. So 2-day you pay when a person comes back, works for how long, and you can have to pay 2 days again?
It's only per calendar year. So.